Has World War III already begun? A number of serious people have recently claimed that it has, including the French historian Emmanuel Todd and the world-renowned economist Nouriel Roubini. Needless to say, the words World War III tend to conjure some pretty terrifying images in our minds, so I don't raise this question lightly. But since it's one that people are asking, I came to the conclusion that I needed to address it on this channel. And in order to address this question, I've turned to planetary cycles, and one in particular, the Eris-Pluto cycle. Now, technically, neither Eris nor Pluto are planets, so we might call this a dwarf planet cycle. But even though these two bodies are small, they seem to have big things to say. In this episode, I'm going to introduce Eris to those of you who aren't familiar with it, and then we're going to explore the current Pluto-Eris cycle and see how it's timed global conflicts over and over again. And it seems to be making a statement about the situation we find ourselves in today. Now, if you're of an anxious disposition, you may want to skip this episode. But if you're ready for the information I have here and believe that forewarned is forearmed, then let's go. So in this episode, as I said, we're going to be concerning ourselves with the synodic cycle of Pluto and Eris. And if you're a regular viewer of this channel, then Pluto needs no introduction. We've examined Pluto's influence on astrology many times before, but Eris may be new to you. And one of the reasons for that is that Eris is pretty new to humanity. It's a dwarf planet orbiting the sun at 3 times the distance of Pluto. But she could be described as Pluto's twin, another ball of rock and ice sailing through the Kuiper belt in the outer reaches of the solar system. Eris was discovered in 2005, and at first she was thought to be even bigger than Pluto. So the discovery of Eris posed a question. Was this another planet to be added to the pantheon? And if it wasn't a planet, what did that mean for Pluto? Eris is actually more massive than Pluto. Well, rather than add another planet, astrologers chose to redefine the meaning of the word planet entirely. A planet, they said, had to have cleared its neighborhood of other objects. But neither Pluto nor Eris have done that. They move through the rocky Kuiper belt. So Pluto was stripped of its planetary status, and both Pluto and Eris were declared to be dwarf planets. But all this had caused a huge debate in astronomy, and not everyone agreed with Pluto's demotion. So Eris, who was originally named Xena after the TV warrior princess, was renamed after the Greek goddess of strife and discord. And that brings us to an important question as far as this channel is concerned. What does Eris mean in astrology? Well, given that she was discovered so recently, it's a bit early to say for sure. Remember, ancient astrologers came to decide what the visible planets meant after centuries or perhaps millennia of observation. But we've been observing Eris for a little over 15 years now. Now, of course, we can't be completely sure what she means at this point, but astrologers have been working on this. And one of them is Kieran LeGrice, whose book Discovering Eris I would recommend to anybody who's interested in introducing Eris to their astrology. LeGrice is a very smart astrologer of the Richard Tarnas archetypal school, and he employs several different strategies in the book for trying to uncover what Eris might mean. He considers the mythical associations of the goddess Eris, and he surveys historical events and the zeitgeist around the time of her discovery. And LeGrice also notes that there seems to be some kind of correlation between a planet's distance from the sun and how fundamental its related archetypal principle is. So Eris, LeGrice infers, must be symbolic of a principle that's even deeper, even more profound, even more archaic than that of Pluto, the chthonic lord of death, rebirth processes, and transformation. Now, Eris's discovery in 2005 came during a period marked by the phenomenon of global terrorism, as well as the US's reaction to that, the global war on terror. And at the same time, this was also a period when the world was hit by a sequence of extremely destructive natural disasters. So LeGrice makes a provisional conclusion that Eris might have to do with reactions to globalization, either from groups who feel marginalized or violated by its processes or by the Earth itself. We can therefore perhaps think of Eris as symbolizing, among other things, the inevitable discord that's accompanying the formation of a global civilization. If you're enjoying this episode, please do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you haven't already, why not subscribe to the channel too, and make sure you don't miss future episodes. So what do we see when we examine the synodic cycle of Pluto and Eris? Well, we get a cycle that seems to time outbreaks of global conflict, including both the world wars. Remember, we get a synodic cycle by looking at the relative positions of two bodies from our perspective on Earth. The best known of them, of course, is the lunation cycle, which ties in the sun and the moon and results in the changing appearance of the moon, which shifts from an invisible new moon to a full moon and back again over the course of a month. So a synodic cycle begins with a conjunction, then we get a waxing sextile, a waxing square, a waxing trine, then the opposition. And then we get the waning trine, the waning square, the waning sextile, and then a conjunction again. This is the beginning of a new cycle. And while Pluto takes about 248 years to orbit the Sun, Eris takes about 560. But both bodies have elliptical orbits, so their synodic cycle varies greatly in length. We usually see a period of between 440 and 480 years between successive conjunctions of Pluto and Eris. But there can be as little as 350 years between these conjunctions, and possibly even less than that. Now we're going to look at the major events that happened at the time of the major aspects of the current Pluto-Eris cycle. Now the orbs I'll be using in what follows are those recommended by Richard Tarnas in Cosmos and Psyche. So the current Pluto-Eris cycle began with a single conjunction in 1756. And this very year happens to be a hugely important one historically. This is the year the 7 Years' War began. This war broke out on May the 17th, 1756, with Pluto and Eris less than 1 degree from conjunction. But what was the 7 Years' War? Well, it's generally held by historians to have been the first global war in history. It was a war between two alliances of powers, led by Great Britain and France, respectively. And it involved fighting in Europe, in the Americas, in Asia Pacific. In other words, it spanned the globe. And the British and French were essentially fighting to establish global preeminence. And the British won, which led to the dominance of the British Empire over the following 2 centuries. But as we've seen many times before on this channel, events at a conjunction reveal the themes that a cycle will be concerned with. And Winston Churchill himself referred to the 7 Years' War as the First World War. So we see that this Pluto-Eris cycle was destined from the start to concern global conflicts. Between 1855 and 1859, Pluto and Eris made a sequence of sextiles. In a synodic cycle, a sextile will tend to be the time when the fruits of what was born at the conjunction will first begin to show themselves. And around this time, we see 2 wars with global implications: the US Civil War and the Crimean War. It's the Crimean War that probably best qualifies as a global conflict. It was primarily fought between Russia and an alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. And they were fighting for control of Crimea and the Black Sea region. It saw naval and land battles around the Crimean Peninsula, and it had significant geopolitical consequences. It led to the decline of Russian influence in Europe and the rise of powers like Germany and Italy. Between 1907 and 1911, Pluto and Eris made a series of squares. Very soon after these squares, war broke out in the Balkans. The First and Second Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. And they in turn served as a prelude for what came in 1914, the outbreak of the First World War. Now, as everyone knows, that war broke out after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. And at this moment, Pluto and Eris were still 3 degrees from an exact square. I won't describe the First World War in depth here. I think most of you know the story. But of course, as its name suggests, it was a global conflict. It was fought in Europe, it was fought in the Middle East, it was fought in Africa and in Asia Pacific. Now, between 1940 and 1943, Pluto and Eris made a series of trines. And of course, the Second World War is held to have begun on the 1st of September 1939, with the German invasion of Poland. At that time, Pluto and Eris were less than 2 degrees from an exact trine. Now, the trine is a harmonious aspect, but when we're dealing with 2 bodies of the nature of Pluto and Eris, that can simply mean that both bodies are in agreement about the very challenging events which follow. So now we see that both world wars, as well as the 7 Years' War, began with Pluto and Eris less than 3 degrees from an exact major aspect. Now, between 1976 and 1978, Pluto and Eris made oppositions. And at this time, we find almost the entire world split between 2 vast, ideologically opposed coalitions, one led by the United States, one led by the USSR. Now, fortunately, they didn't go to war directly, but they did fight proxy wars that were going on at this time, including Afghanistan, Vietnam, while Pluto and Eris were in opposition. And in 1983, with that Pluto-Eris opposition still well within orb, the world came almost as close as it's ever come to nuclear Armageddon, with the exception of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, we're very fortunate to have survived the events of 1983, but the oppositional nature of this period is pretty clear to see. Now, around the year 2000, Pluto moved to within 10 degrees of orb of a trine with Eris. Soon after that, with Saturn and Pluto in opposition, came 9/11 and the global war on terror, the United States' global campaign against Al-Qaeda and all the rest. And of course, the global war on terror included the invasions of Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003. Now, the global war on terror was a different kind of conflict to the world wars, but it was a global conflict of a kind, and it broke out with Pluto and Eris very close to another major aspect. Now, in 2020 and 2021, Pluto and Eris made their waning squares. And these were the years that will, of course, be remembered for the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, many astrologers have made the connection between the Pluto-Eris square and the pandemic, and they may well be right to do that. But what we've seen at every major aspect of this Pluto-Eris cycle is the breakout of global conflicts. And of course, we are witnessing a major armed conflict right now. The Russian invasion of Ukraine began on February the 22nd, 2022, with Pluto and Eris less than 4 degrees from an exact square. But arguably this war began several years earlier, in 2014, with the Russian annexation of Crimea and the breakout of conflict in the Donbass. And 2014 is the year that Pluto and Eris moved to within 10-degree orb of a square. That's the orb that Tarnas recommends for this aspect. So what conclusions can we draw from this? We've seen global conflicts break out at every major aspect of the Pluto-Eris cycle, and it seems like we're seeing another one now. Now, of course, so far, the fighting itself has kept within the borders of Ukraine, but the two sides are being supported by countries all around the world, and both sides have been taking steps to expand and consolidate their alliances. For example, Russia recently announced that it would be stationing nuclear weapons in Belarus, and NATO has expanded to take in new members. And more than that, the war has also spiraled into a kind of economic conflict. The US and its allies tried to subdue Russia with sanctions, and Russia has responded by working with its allies, including China, to try and reinvent the global financial system. And as I've mentioned on this channel before, a process of de-dollarization seems to be underway. Now, it may or may not succeed, and it probably won't happen overnight. But to return to the question we started with, has World War III started? I think that based on the research I've presented, we have to conclude that it might have. Even the biggest wars tend to start relatively localized before expanding to other theaters as more parties get drawn into the conflict. It certainly seems possible that this conflict could expand. The stakes are now extremely high for both sides, and the possibility of peace seems very remote. And tensions are also getting higher in another theater, the Taiwan Strait. Something we should bear in mind is that Uranus is going to move into Gemini in 2025, 2026. And every time Uranus has moved into Gemini since the United States was born, that country has been involved in a serious armed conflict, which has reconfigured its institutions and its role in the world. Is what we're watching now a prelude to something beginning in 2025, 2026? Now, we don't know for sure. Now, all of this is pretty scary stuff, so I do want to finish with some reasons to possibly be a bit more hopeful. In this video, S.J. Anderson and I talked about the Barbeau Cyclic Index, which is a graph that plots the total angular distance between all the outer planets. Andre Barbeau, the astrologer who popularized its use, thought that the dips coincided with times of greater challenge and conflict in the world. And indeed, the dips have coincided with both world wars. One reason to be hopeful is that the dip we've been in, which covers the COVID period and the breakout of the Ukraine war, has already bottomed. It reached its lowest point in early 2023, and it's now going upwards. Now, this index isn't a precise astrological tool, but I'd rather have that dip behind us than in front of us. And another reason to be hopeful is this. We've already witnessed an opposition between Pluto and Eris in the late 70s at the height of the Cold War. Now, while the Cold War had many terrible consequences and there were many awful proxy wars that took place, Fortunately, it didn't result in an all-out conflict between the two sides. It didn't result in nuclear war because the two sides, the US and the USSR, understood that nobody could win in such a conflict. Let's hope that once again, common sense and self-preservation prevail. That's it for this episode. See you next time.